scale. In fact, in the original research, they used 2 teacher scales. We selected the one that was the better of the 2. And an example of these teacher rating scales was, can the child deliberately calm down when he or she is excited or all wound up? Does the child grab for the belongings of others? Does the child interrupt inappropriately in conversations with peers or wait his turn to speak? It's sort of strange because they gave the original study to junior high school middle kids, and so this doesn't sound quite like you're asking a teacher about a middle schooler, but anyway. Okay, so we used, in the Duckworth and Seligman methodology, to establish the validity, they used 8 measures, 2 student measures, 2 teacher measures, 2 parent measures, a monetary choice test, and a delay of gratification scale. Their methodology was a little unusual. To reduce multicollinearity and increase validity, they standardized and combined the scales into a single composite score. These composite scores were then recoded so that to reflect greater self-discipline with higher numbers. Okay, so that was the basic study that they were doing, and in the next slide is some of the results that they reported. They also found gender differences. I won't get into that tonight, but that was published in the Journal of Ed Psych article. The other article for the APS journals, and it had to do with its predictive power over intelligence. The correlation between self-discipline composite scores, again, composite scores were standardized and averaged, was 0.67, much higher than the correlation between IQ and GPA. Okay, they were predicting GPA using either their composite score or IQ. And what they found was that, again, 67 with theirs, the R for IQ was just 0.32. And when you combine them both together in the same regression equation, the beta was much larger for IQ than it was for self-discipline than it was for IQ. We thought these were pretty impressive numbers, and again, it was sort of a clarion call that self-regulation could predict in the same levels that you would get out of an IQ test. As I mentioned to you, the self-discipline items represent an intriguing comparison because they focus on attention, performance control, and perseverance rather than on self-regulated use of self-regulated learning processes. So, in comparing these 2 sets of measures then, we ask ourselves several key questions. Are self-discipline and self-regulated learning factorially distinctive? And if so, which construct is more predictive of students' academic grades and achievement on standardized tests? So this was our 3rd study. We conducted it in the DC area with high school students, over 500 high school students. The population was, as you can see, European in extraction, ranged in age between 15 and 19, and involved students from all 4 grades. Okay, so for this study, basically we selected 2 students' self-discipline measures, the icing scale, the impulsivity scale, the brief self-control scale, which are the ones I read the items to, and the teacher rating scale. We selected those 3 because it sort of balanced off with the 2 that we had that were self-report plus 1 teacher scale. We also included the MSLQ as a marker variable. We expected basically factorially that it would load on the same factor as the other scales that we developed from responsibility. Okay, the reliability of the measures were present in the next study. You can see they were all were appropriate, and impulsiveness was a bit low, but certainly adequate for our purposes. We did a factor analysis, an exploratory principle components factor analysis of the total scores for the 4 SRLs and the 3 self-discipline measures, including both the teacher and the student measures. And what it revealed was a single underlying factor that accounted for 44% of the variance. All seven measures loaded more than 0.40 on that factor. The 4 SRL factor loadings range from 0.71 to 0.76, whereas the 3 self-discipline measures range from 0.50 to 0.62. Then we conducted a series of hierarchical regressions designed to compare the predictive power of the self-regulation measures with those of the self-discipline measures. The first outcome variable was the high school student's GPA, and initially we entered the self-discipline first in the hierarchical analysis, and then the self-regulated learning measures second. And then in our analysis, then we reversed the order so we could determine the priority effects. The second outcome measure was a standardized test of achievement that was given in the school. Okay, here are the results. As you can see, hopefully the numbers are, can you read them? Okay. One good advantage of a smaller room. Notice that now again, we're predicting GPA using both sets of variables. First of all, we put in the self-discipline measures, and they accounted for 34% of the variance. And you can see they're all significant. Then when we add the second variable, the self-regulation measures, to it, the prediction goes up to 0.73% of the variance, and it's an increase of 0.39, 39%. Notice also that when you look at the combined measures, the beta weights for the self-discipline measures are much smaller than those that were for the self-regulation measures. And the self-measure did particularly well among those, above those. Oh, and you can see, by the way, also, I think I mentioned it, but in that factor analysis, the MSLQ loaded on the same factor as the other self-discipline and self-regulation measures. Okay, so then we decided to reverse the order to see what happens if you put self-regulation in first, and what happened. What happened was it accounted for 70% of the variance, and when you put the second model in, which involved both self-regulation and self-discipline, it increased it by another 3% of the variance. Again, what you see, the same kind of factor loadings on the self-discipline measure tend to be lower than the ones that were on the various SRL kind of measures, and the self itself did particularly well. Okay, so then we wanted to conduct the same analysis on the standardized test scores. I would say that when Duckworth and Seligman did their study, they hypothesized that the prediction power of self-discipline would be less with one-shot kinds of standardized tests than it would be against a multiple measure things such as GPA. And you can see that's very much the case in the way the data turned out. Again, putting in self-discipline first and predicting those, these are some combined standardized scores from math, verbal, and some others. It explained about 12% of the variance. When you added the SRL measures to the equation, it went up 26%. And again, looking at the beta weights, you can see that the beta weights for the self-regulation learning items tended to be higher. So then we flipped it, reversed the order with this one as well. And we found that similar results to what we found with the GPA. Again, the first model accounted for 38% of the variance. When they added the self-discipline measures, it significantly increased it, but it was less than 1. It's significant because we have a large sample. And again, it's sort of interesting, the self-measure you can see is, even among the other SRL measures, tended to do pretty well. Okay, conclusions. The self-discipline and the self-regulation constructs seem to stem from the same underlying factor. The size of the loadings of the SRL factors measures were consistently higher on the underlying factor than the self-discipline measures. The size of the beta weights of the SRL measures were consistently higher than the self-discipline measures in predicting GPA and performance on the standardized test. However, I should point out, again, we used just 3 scales out of 8 when Ducksworth and Zimmerman did their study. So we selected the best ones to match up with ours, but it did not test the full scope of their measures. For example, they had parent measures as well, and we didn't have those included in the study. So that's my presentation. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take.
If you could actually contextualize what some of these findings mean for how we actually define, how you feel about the definitions of self-regulation in the literature. Do you feel like this will add to a refinement of those definitions? And those are the kind of things that we need to keep in mind.
Well, first of all, they added a new one to self-control, and they're recognizing the self-control already. So I'm not sure whether that was going to be, certainly isn't going to improve the parsimony of the whole situation. But I think, again, you have to, like anybody else, they can label their variables as they wish. Yeah. To me, what was important was sort of looking at the nature of these items and how they differed. And what you could see was that in those other items, oftentimes they were not even talking about academic learning. They were talking about other kinds of. And for people who think that situational information is important, that's a liability. And that's one of the reasons why we decided to do the study, because I couldn't imagine those types of items predicting as well as the ones that we've been using traditionally. But I'll say this, there is almost a parallel universe, for those of you who have read Baumeister and Bo's book, of the people who are doing research in developmental psychology and personality psychology. They tend to view those kinds of measures rather than the types that we use. What was interesting here was, though, they found Duckworth and Zimmerman that this measure did so well compared to IQ. So that's what sort of intrigued us to say, well, because we had actually reported similar kind of results in previous years, but nothing as intensive as this one in terms of trying to nail it down.
Brittany Zimmerman, you talk about in one of your research studies, you talk about volitional control. Do you see a similarity between the can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Do you see a similarity between the the SD and the volitional control that you looked at? Did you see a similarity there between what you were calling volitional control in your studies?
I actually I didn't measure volitional control.
Okay.
I just put a gap between motivational and volitional. So I looked at the motivational side. But I think it's more about metacognition here, about knowing about metacognitive strategies and continuity.
Thank you. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Sorry about that. Braska, did you have something to say? No.
Well, I keep repeating over this question again and again and again, this issue about knowledge and skills. You're using questionnaires, and are you certain that it is self-regulation, that means the skills for self-regulation, or that it is, let's say, the attitude or the knowledge that they have what they should do in order to self-regulate?
Well, I think in terms of our data, there were self-report data, so you could always argue that a lot of these are impressionistic, and they're not. You could say that it could be knowledge, but again, 2 points. We included in our measures the teacher rating scale, and so did they, and they included parent scales, and so their construct, as well as ours, are not just from the point of view of the student. They're not just simply saying these things. So there's been, I think, and that scale had been, again, correlated with other kinds of measures, the teacher measure that we've been using since the late 80s. So I think it's important, obviously, to get closer today to the kind of data you're talking about. I wrote an article in the current issue of AERJ talking about the importance of trying to develop event measures. This is not an event measure that we're developing. This is what I call a person measure. And I think the event measures will move our research closer to online processes. So behaviors and self-reports of results will be closer than they were before. And you won't have the disparity between, is this just an answer not connected with any kind of behavioral reality? Steve?
We've spoken about the MSLQ in my study and how it's not really sensitive to changes over an academic year.
Right.
Do you see this yourself being sensitive to changes? I don't think you have the data from these studies.
No. I don't think it will be.
But what about the AERJ and the event questionnaire?
I frankly think if you want change, you need to go to an event format. Now, that doesn't mean these other ones don't pick up some variance. Some of the studies that I reported that were done in Germany basically had a combination of event measures as well as person measures and showed changes on those. But when you have a measure that's, you're asking somebody about self-efficacy before they're going to do a particular math problem, and you ask them afterwards, you're tightening, again, their causal relationship down much closer, and I think it gives us a better feel for the science of it. Also, the measures are designed to be experience-focused, so they are more likely to see changes. So, again, I would see this as a measure of individual differences. You could try it with change score, but I don't consider it to be a strong one. That's why we changed personally to microanalytic procedures, and I think we'll be able to account for more variance in that way. Yes?
When you were comparing your work to Moses and Baumeister, I just kept thinking, trait versus state, or situational versus personality. Is that what you were getting at, or?
No, what I was trying to get at was really the nature of the items that were being used in those studies. Again, they're often talking about self-regulation of emotional control with young children. So there tend to be more volitional in their kind of nature. It's trying to keep the person on task doing something to make it happen, as opposed to measuring their ability to learn more effectively. To me, I didn't see that coming out in the items there, which is very different than the other kind of scales that we've used by the group, particularly within AERA that does research on self-regulation. Yes, Jim?
Do you see self-discipline as a viable construct, or how would you respond to somebody that it is a viable and important concept to assess, and would you have a response to that?
Well, I think it is, but again, they use measures that have self-control in the title, and I think impulsivity scale. So, I mean, that tells you a little bit about the nature of of what they're documenting. So, whether you call it self-discipline or self-control, it seems like it's pretty close. And again, I'd say in Baumeister and Bosses, if you look at those articles, it's much more of that type of an item, which I think is good. I think basically we have two, again, parallel universes going on, and it's unfortunate there isn't a lot of cross-citation going on, and I think that's important. Some of us do because we're in social learning, and Walter Mischel does research on delayed gratification, which is more in the other tradition. So I think it's important to connect both of them. Okay, thank you very much.